This morning, we will honor our Lord's resurrection by looking at two stories at the tomb in John 20, 1 through 18. The two stories are connected and yet have distinct plots. They convey information and paradigms or patterns. It communicates what is history, and it tells us stories about something that we all experience with the risen Jesus through their experience with the risen Jesus. So on Friday, after the crucifixion of Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body to bury it, and Nicodemus joined him and brought about 100 pounds of oils and spices to be buried with the body. Now, it was 100 pounds in Greek and Roman measurements, but in our day, it would be about 75 pounds of spice. And in John 19, starting in verse 40, it says, "So they took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen strippings with the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. Now, in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. Therefore, because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there." Now, Matthew reveals that the tomb belonged to Joseph of Arimathea, and that it was a new tomb in Matthew 27:60. And so this is Friday, before sundown. Once the sun had set, in the Jewish way of thinking, it was Saturday, and it was the Sabbath. So here is where 19 ends. And we pick up our first story, which I have entitled, "The Empty Tomb Discovered," in chapter 20, verses 1 through 10. So as we go through, keep in mind that the word tomb is repeated 8 times. And literally, it comes from the root that means to remember. And thus, you can understand how it's a place to remember the departed, the dead. But for John's purposes, he gives it a radically different meaning. It becomes a place to remember the one who was no longer dead. He is departed. And that tomb, that empty tomb, is discovered by 3 characters in total. In verses 1 and 2, John records the small section of the tomb discovered by Mary. Let's go ahead and read those 2 verses. It says, "Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came early to the tomb while it was still dark, and saw the stone already taken away from the tomb. So she ran and came to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and said to them, 'They have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have laid him.'" Now we know Mary from the other gospel had 7 demons cast out of her by Christ. And she, this morning, on Sunday morning, she's coming to finish the burial preparations. Now she's identified as Mary Magdalene, in order to distinguish her, to differentiate her from the other Marys. Now, Magdalene means she came from the city of Magdala, which is a city on the Sea of Galilee, south of Capernaum, and it means, literally, tower. So this Mary from Magdala is a Mary who comes from the tower, in the tower, and it's fitting because she's the one that makes the announcements. When you're have a city that has a tower, the person in the tower looks out and reports news of things that are happening. So while Mary discovers the empty tomb, she does not make the important discovery, the discovery of his resurrection. So here, when she sees the tomb, she's remembering, and she thinks of horrible things. Notice that the text says that she came while it was still dark. Now, in John's gospel, darkness and light communicate understanding and lack of understanding, spiritual darkness and spiritual light. And here, Mary comes in the darkness. It symbolizes literally that she has a lack of understanding. She doesn't understand yet that Jesus has been raised from the dead. What she sees is that the stone had already been taken away from the tomb. Now, the stone was usually very heavy. It usually took multiple people to move it. And thus what she's thinking is multiple people did move it and stole the body. Now that did happen because there was a decree by Emperor Claudius in AD, who reigned in AD 41 through 54, that said if anyone should destroy or remove bodies or displace seals or stones from the tombs, they should be killed. They should have the sentence of death. So we know that it did happen, but it was rare. And here she's thinking, well, they have taken away the Lord out of the tomb. And who is they? That would be the enemies of Jesus. It would be the Jewish leadership or the Roman authority who killed him. And so thus she fears the worst, and thus she runs. And she ran and came to Simon Peter and the other disciples whom Jesus loved. And so what this means is that she came from this location where the cross was in the garden. And if you notice, there's two entrances to Jerusalem, here or here. So she had to run quite a distance, and depending on where they are in the city, she had to run even farther. So she ran, and she came to Simon Peter and the other disciple whom Jesus loved, which is John. And what does she say? She says, they have taken away our Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have laid him. Literally, where they put him. So what does that tell us? It tells us she did not expect a resurrection. That wasn't on her radar. That wasn't in her field of interpretation. Now, when it says the disciple whom Jesus loved, that's not agape love, it's phileo love, which means a brotherly family relationship. And from the other details in the Gospels, we know that this is John, the one who writes the letter himself. And notice that Mary says, they have taken away the Lord from the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. Now, this comports and goes along with the rest of the Gospels that say that there's a group of women that came to the tomb. But John focuses specifically on Mary Magdalene and doesn't want to get caught up in the rest of those other ladies and all the rest of the details. He focuses on her story to communicate a message. So with this report, the next two characters are now introduced. In verses 3 through 10, we have the tomb discovered by Peter and John. Now, in ancient Jewish culture, it was not accepted that women were witnesses. For most legal purposes, women could not be witnesses. They couldn't share testimony as far as what is true and what is not true. And even less so in Roman courts. So in John's gospel, although in God's economy, in God's people, women do, are valuable. Their testimony and words are just as valuable as men. But in that culture, it wasn't. And to reach that culture, and to give that testimony, John then records these next two characters. So this next scene legally establishes the tomb being empty. And it comports with Jewish custom in Deuteronomy 19:15, which says, in the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter should be confirmed. So here we have 2 witnesses in Peter and John. The first couple verses say, so Peter and the other disciple went forth, and they were going to the tomb. And the two were running together, and the other disciple ran ahead faster than Peter and came to the tomb first. And stooping and looking in, he saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. Now, why is John telling us about his running ability? Is this really important to the resurrection story? No. It's there for a reason. Now, notice it says he came to the tomb first, the place of remembering first, before Peter. It foreshadows what's about to happen, and it helps us to interpret what's about to happen. So he's stooping down, and he saw the burial cloth. Now, usually the doors in the tomb was about 3 feet high, so he would literally have to stoop in and crawl in to get inside. And remember, it's still very early. And it was probably difficult to see inside the cave-like tomb. But he makes out that the linen wrappings are there, and presumably that they're flat. So when we talk about linen wrappings, that can indicate one of three scenarios as far as the burial clothing of Jesus. Now, one, it can refer to wrappings like a mummy that would go around and around. That was a custom in that day. It also could refer to a long piece of linen that was wrapped around him, and then also a head scarf that would be tied around and up this way to hold the jaw shut. This long linen is what the Shroud of Turin is like, and whether that is Jesus or not, his image in the Shroud of Turin, it is an image of a man who was crucified, and it shows that at least somewhere along those lines in history, men were wrapped for burial this way. The third way is that it had this long linen shroud around and then had wrappings around. Now, however Jesus was wrapped, the point is that John saw them. And the way the wrappings were, the way the clothing was laid in the tomb, it signified to him that the body was gone. So why didn't John go in? Well, number one, he was probably stunned to see the burial clothes and no body. He's probably thinking, now what? What do I do? What do I go in for to see an empty tomb? He's also probably a little bit cautious and fearful. The guilty party might still be around, maybe even still in the tomb. The door is a small door, and it's quite dark in there. So he waits, because he doesn't know quite what to do, what to make of the situation. Continuing in verse 6 and 7, and so Simon Peter also came following him and entered the tomb, and he saw the linen wrappings lying there, and the face cloth which had been on his head. Not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. Now, when it's rolled, it can mean either folded or rolled. And the face cloth was a wrapping that went around the head this way, that held the chin up and kept the mouth shut. And what is emphasized here is that the burial clothes were there in the tomb, but the body was not with them. And this is just an image of what it may have looked like. In the first century, it was a burial custom that only lasted a few hundred years before and after, of keeping the body wrapped up for about a year and letting all the flesh, organs deteriorate and decay, and then after a year coming back and gathering the bones and putting them in these ossuary boxes. So this is just a picture of a tomb. Obviously there's other boxes here, and Jesus was placed in a new tomb. But it gives you just a general picture of what it may have looked like. And the strange thing, and the emphasis on the text, is that the burial clothes were there. Now, why is that being emphasized? Why is that important? Well, because it shows that the body wasn't stolen by grave robbers.